What if some of history's strangest discoveries were hiding in places almost nobody talks about? A prehistoric tomb filled with dog skulls, a palace covered in hundreds of stone masks, a city buried beneath volcanic ash, and ancient monuments that disappeared beneath the water. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, archaeologists have uncovered places that seem almost impossible to explain at first. A fortress built around an underground water source, a giant earthwork aligned with the moon, a prehistoric sculpture that still looks strangely human, and temples slowly swallowed by the jungle. These aren't legends. They're real archaeological sites, built by real people, thousands of years ago. Tonight, we're going to explore some of the most unusual ancient discoveries ever uncovered. Places that reveal how our ancestors lived, what they believed, and what they left behind. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin with the first forgotten discovery. The village that vanished between two villages. Krakow was once a thriving hilltop town in southern Italy. Families lived among its stone houses. Farmers worked the surrounding fields, and generations of residents built their lives around the old medieval settlement. Today, the streets are almost completely empty. Windows stare out from abandoned buildings. Churches stand without congregations, and entire homes remain frozen on the hillside, as if their inhabitants simply walked away. But Krakow did not disappear because of war. It was slowly abandoned after the ground beneath it became increasingly unstable. The history of Krakow reaches back many centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were living in the area long before the medieval town took its final form. Its position was practical. The settlement stood high above the surrounding landscape, offering protection and wide views across the countryside. Over time, Krakow developed into a compact medieval community. Stone houses climbed the steep hillside, surrounding churches, small courtyards, narrow streets, and defensive structures. For centuries, the town remained closely connected to agriculture. Wheat, olives, grapes, and other crops were cultivated across the surrounding hills. Life was demanding, but Krakow's elevated position provided a degree of protection from flooding and offered control over the surrounding territory. The settlement continued growing until the landscape itself began creating problems. Krakow was built on a geological formation composed of clay and sandstone. These materials can become particularly unstable when exposed to water. Over generations, heavy rainfall, ground movement, and erosion gradually weakened sections of the hillside. Cracks began appearing in buildings, walls shifted, roads became unsafe. The problem was not a single sudden disaster, but a slow transformation of the ground beneath the town. By the 20th century, the situation had become increasingly serious. Landslides damaged houses and roads, while parts of the historic center became dangerous to inhabit. Residents began leaving Krakow, moving into newer settlements and safer locations. The old town gradually lost its population. Families abandoned homes that their ancestors had occupied for generations. By the late 20th century, Krakow had effectively become a ghost town. Yet the abandonment created something unusual. Because new construction largely stopped, the historic buildings remained. Stone stairways, old courtyards, church facades, and medieval structures survived across the hillside. Instead of being replaced by modern buildings, the old town slowly became an archaeological and architectural time capsule. Among the most recognizable structures is the Church of Santa Maria della Neve, along with the remains of the town's other churches and civic buildings. Their interiors have suffered from centuries of weather, but the surviving architecture still reveals the organization of the medieval settlement. The narrow streets follow the contours of the hill, creating a town shaped directly by its landscape. Archaeologists and conservation specialists continue studying Krakow, especially the relationship between the settlement and the unstable geology beneath it. Modern surveys help identify areas at risk of further collapse, while preservation efforts attempt to protect the surviving structures. The challenge is enormous. The same landscape that helped Krakow survive for centuries is also slowly destroying it. Today, Krakow looks almost unreal. The town rises above the surrounding fields, but there are no crowds moving through its streets. No market fills the old square. No families gather behind the ancient walls. Only wind passes through the abandoned buildings. Yet the silence has preserved something important: the physical record of a community, its architecture, its streets, and the traces of ordinary lives. The village that vanished between two villages is not a story about a civilization suddenly disappearing. It is the story of a town slowly surrendering to the landscape beneath it. Craco remains suspended above southern Italy, a remarkable reminder that sometimes history is not destroyed by a single event. It simply becomes too fragile for people to remain. The fortress whose walls still hum at certain hours. Chufut Kale was built on a place that was difficult to reach and even harder to attack. The settlement stands on a high limestone plateau in Crimea, with steep cliffs falling away beneath it. From the edge of the fortress, the surrounding valleys stretch into the distance. For the people who lived here, the landscape itself was already a defense. Only the accessible approaches needed walls. The history of Chufut Kale reaches back to the early medieval period. Archaeological evidence points to occupation on the plateau by around the 6th century. Over the centuries, different political powers controlled the region, but its greatest advantage remained the same: its position. The plateau was high, isolated, and naturally difficult to assault. The builders made remarkable use of the limestone. The rock was not simply a foundation, it became part of the town itself. Caves and chambers were carved into the plateau, creating storage spaces, cellars, workshops, and other practical rooms. The result was almost like two settlements occupying the same place, a town on the surface, and another hidden beneath it. The defensive system strengthened the vulnerable approaches. Stone walls controlled the main entrances, while narrow passages made movement easier to monitor. An attacking force could not approach from every direction. The cliffs forced movement toward specific routes. The walls protected those routes. Defenders high above the valleys could watch anyone approaching. But there was a problem more important than any army: water. A permanent settlement could not survive on a mountain plateau without a dependable supply. There was no great river beside the fortress. Rain had to be collected, stored, and carefully managed. The inhabitants developed cisterns and underground water installations. One of the most remarkable features is the deep well known as Tikkuyu. The shaft descends into the limestone, connecting the settlement above with the hidden world below. Without reliable water, even the strongest fortress could not survive for long. The settlement eventually became much more than a military stronghold. Families lived here. Craftsmen worked here. Food was stored here. Religious communities developed here. The fortress became especially associated with the Crimean Karaite community, who lived on the plateau for centuries. Historic Karaite places of worship still survive among the ruins. Generations were also buried near the settlement, showing how deeply the community became connected to this landscape. As the political landscape changed, people began leaving. New settlements offered easier access to roads and trade. The old plateau became increasingly quiet. Buildings were abandoned. Wooden roofs disappeared. Some structures collapsed. Eventually, Chufut Kale became largely deserted, yet abandonment also helped preserve the settlement. Modern development did not completely cover its ancient streets. The defensive walls remained visible. The caves remained beneath the surface, and the old pathways continued following the contours of the plateau. Then there is the strange story connected with the title of this chapter. Visitors have described unusual sounds around the fortress, especially near the cliffs, caves, and enclosed stone spaces. The limestone can reflect sound in unexpected ways. A voice can travel farther than expected. A footstep can echo between the rocks, and wind moving through narrow openings can produce low tones. At certain moments, the fortress can seem to hum. There is no firm archaeological evidence that the walls were deliberately designed to create this sound. The effect is more likely connected with natural acoustics, combined with the caves and architecture. Still, it is easy to understand how such a place could inspire stories. Archaeological research has uncovered pottery, metal objects, architectural fragments, burial remains, and other traces of occupation. Together, they show that Chufut Kale was a functioning community, not simply an isolated military camp. People lived here, worked here, worshipped here, and buried their dead here. Different communities left their marks across the same plateau. Today, the silence is one of the most striking things about Chufut Kale. The old streets no longer carry merchants. The gates no longer control travelers. The houses no longer contain families. The defensive walls stand without soldiers, and the underground chambers remain dark beneath the stone. Yet the settlement still makes sense when you walk through it. The layout follows the landscape. The water system follows necessity. The fortifications follow the cliffs. Everything reflects the practical decisions of people who understood their surroundings. The fortress eventually lost its political importance, but the stone remained, the caves remained, and the paths remained. Today, they allow us to trace the outline of a community that existed across many generations. The people who once walked these streets have disappeared, yet the place still carries traces of their lives. The story of Chufut Kale is not really about a mysterious sound. It is about a settlement shaped by its landscape, a fortress protected by cliffs, a town built into limestone, a community sustained by hidden water, and a place where different cultures left their marks across centuries. When the wind moves through the empty caves, or a distant sound travels across the stone, the abandoned fortress can feel strangely alive, not because the walls are truly speaking, but because the landscape still carries echoes of the people who once depended on it. And after centuries of silence, Chufut Kale remains above the valleys, its ancient walls holding the memory of a town that refused to disappear completely. The 23,000-year-old wall. Theopetra Cave lies in Thessaly, near the modern town of Kalambaka. For ancient people, the cave offered protection from cold weather, rain, wind, and the harsh conditions of the Ice Age. Different groups returned across thousands of years, leaving layer after layer of evidence behind. Excavations uncovered stone tools, animal bones, fireplaces, pottery, and human remains. The deepest deposits reach back into the Middle Paleolithic, showing that different human groups used the cave at different points in its history. Among the most unusual discoveries was a stone wall near the cave entrance. It was made from carefully arranged stones, creating a barrier across part of the opening. It was not a massive construction. Its purpose appears to have been practical. Researchers have suggested that it may have reduced cold air entering the cave, making the shelter more comfortable during an exceptionally cold period. That simple purpose makes the discovery remarkable. The wall dates to roughly 23,000 years ago, a time of severe climatic conditions. Temperatures were much lower than today, and the landscape around Theopetra looked very different from modern Greece. The people living there could not control the climate, but they could change their shelter. The wall may have been a simple solution to a difficult environment. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers, living long before permanent cities. Their survival depended on understanding the landscape. They knew where animals moved, where water could be found, and where shelter was available. The wall shows another part of that relationship. They were not simply accepting the cave as nature had provided it. They were modifying it. Suitable stones had to be selected, carried to the entrance, and arranged into a stable barrier. The cave also contains evidence of repeated fires. Ash and charcoal show that people gathered around hearths. Fire provided warmth, light, and a way to prepare food. Stone tools reveal activities connected with hunting and processing animals. Theopetra was more than a place to escape the weather. It was a living space. Human burials were also discovered inside the cave. These belong to later prehistoric periods, showing that Theopetra continued to have meaning long after the oldest wall was built. The cave changed with time. It was a shelter, a living space, a workplace, and eventually, a place where the dead were buried. Eventually, the Ice Age ended. Temperatures rose, vegetation changed, and animal populations shifted. Human societies changed as well. Farming appeared. Permanent settlements became more common. Pottery entered everyday life. The world around Theopetra slowly moved towards settled communities. The wall itself requires some caution when described as the oldest human-made structure on Earth. Archaeology rarely offers such simple records. Different sites contain structures of different types, and dating extremely ancient construction can be complicated. The safer conclusion is that the Theopetra wall is an exceptionally early example of deliberate human construction, dating to around 23,000 years ago. Its importance comes not only from its age, but from what it tells us about human adaptation. The wall suggests that people living during one of the harshest periods of the Ice Age were capable of making practical improvements to their environment. They did not need monumental architecture. They needed warmth, shelter, and a place where they could survive another cold season. A simple barrier at a cave entrance could make a meaningful difference. The desire was familiar: to make a home safer, warmer, and more comfortable. Modern archaeology continues studying Theopetra. Researchers examine sediments, animal remains, stone tools, and the changing environment around the cave. Every layer contains another part of the story. The deepest deposits belong to a world almost impossible to imagine. The upper layers reveal the transition towards settled life. The cave becomes a timeline, preserved in earth and stone. Today, Theopetra Cave remains one of the most remarkable prehistoric sites in Greece. The people who built the wall left no written explanation. We do not know their names. We do not know what they called the cave. But we can see the result of their decision. A barrier was needed, so they built one. The solution was simple. The history behind it is enormous. The stones that once protected a small Ice Age shelter have survived longer than countless cities, kingdoms, and monuments. They were never meant to become famous. They were simply useful. A practical construction made by people trying to survive a difficult period. And that may be what makes Theopetra so fascinating. It does not show us kings, or armies, or monumental temples. It shows ordinary people solving an ordinary problem more than 20,000 years ago. The 23,000-year-old wall reminds us that human construction began long before cities and civilizations. Inside Theopetra Cave, a few carefully placed stones preserve evidence of people who understood their environment, adapted their shelter, and found ways to survive a changing world. The wall is small. The history behind it is immense. And after roughly 23,000 years, those stones still remain, quietly preserving one of the earliest chapters in the story of human construction. The antler headdresses of Starkar. More than 11,000 years ago, people were living beside a large lake in northern England. They hunted in the forests, collected plants, caught fish, and made tools from stone, bone, wood, and antler. Their settlement is known today as Starkar. But among the remains of this ancient community, archaeologists discovered something particularly unusual: red deer skulls, with their antlers still attached. Some had been carefully modified, creating strange objects that may have been worn as headdresses. Their exact purpose remains unknown. Starkar is located in North Yorkshire, near what was once Lake Flixton. The settlement dates to around 9000 BC. During the early Mesolithic period, Britain was emerging from the last ice age. The climate was becoming warmer. Forests were spreading, and the landscape around the lake was rich with wildlife. For the people living here, the environment provided almost everything they needed. The lake offered fish and birds, the wetlands provided plants and other resources, and the surrounding woodland was home to deer, wild boar, and other large animals. The wet ground around the ancient lake created unusual conditions for archaeology. Materials that normally disappear survived beneath the sediments. Wood remained preserved, bone remained preserved, antler remained preserved. Even traces of ancient structures survived. Excavations uncovered thousands of pieces of worked flint, animal bones, wooden objects, and tools made from bone and antler. Together, they provide an unusually detailed picture of Mesolithic life. Red deer were especially important. Their meat provided food. Their hides could be used for clothing. Their bones could become tools. And their antlers were valuable materials. But some deer remains were treated differently. The skull was carefully prepared, while the antlers were left attached. Parts of the bone were removed, and the antlers were modified. The result was something very different from an ordinary animal remains. These objects became known as the Starkar antler headdresses. But why were they made? One possibility is hunting. A person wearing antlers may have been able to imitate a deer, possibly helping them approach animals. But there is no direct evidence proving this. Another possibility is ritual. The headdresses may have been worn during ceremonies, perhaps representing animals, spirits, or a special relationship between humans and the natural world. The truth is still uncertain. The people who created them left no written explanation. What we do know is that making these objects required effort. Someone deliberately selected the skull, prepared the bone, and preserved the antlers. They were not simply discarded remains. Their careful modification suggests that they had some importance. For the people of Starkar, the deer may have been more than a source of food and materials. It may also have had a symbolic place within their culture. The rest of the settlement reveals how skilled these communities were. Thousands of flint fragments show that tools were being produced and repaired. bone and antler were shaped into points, handles, and other objects. Wood was carefully worked as well. The people understood the properties of different materials and used each one for particular purposes. Their technology was simple compared with later civilizations, but highly effective. Archaeologists also discovered evidence of structures beside the ancient lake. Wooden posts and other remains suggest that people deliberately modified the shoreline. Some structures may have been platforms, working areas, or places for moving through the wetland. Their exact purpose is still debated, but the evidence suggests Starkar was not simply a place where people stopped once. They returned repeatedly, possibly across many generations. The animal remains show how closely these people depended on their environment. Red deer were common, but roe deer, wild boar, aurochs, fish, and birds were also used. This variety was important. The community could adapt to seasonal changes, using different resources at different times of the year. The lake, wetlands, and woodland created a rich landscape for hunter-gatherers. The preservation of wood is particularly valuable. At most prehistoric sites, wooden objects disappear completely. At Starkar, the wet sediments protected them. This gives archaeologists evidence of woodworking techniques that would otherwise be lost. It also shows that Mesolithic technology depended on much more than stone. People were skilled at working timber, antler, bone, and other organic materials. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The people moved elsewhere, and the ancient lake continued collecting layers of sediment. The objects were buried. The wooden structures disappeared from the landscape, and Starkar slowly vanished beneath the ground. Thousands of years passed. Before archaeologists began uncovering what remained, the discoveries changed our understanding of Mesolithic Britain. They showed that hunter-gatherer communities were not simply focused on finding food. They built structures, created sophisticated tools, worked organic materials, and may have practiced symbolic or ritual activities. The antler headdresses became some of the most fascinating evidence, but they also remind us how difficult it is to understand prehistoric beliefs. We can study the cuts made into the skulls. We can examine where they were found. We can compare them with other objects, but we cannot know exactly what the people believed. Perhaps the headdresses were connected with hunting. Perhaps they were worn during ceremonies. Perhaps they represented a particular role within the community. Or perhaps their meaning was something completely different. The evidence simply does not tell us. Today, the ancient lake has disappeared. The landscape has changed. There are no Mesolithic hunters walking beside the water. But beneath the ground, their world still survives. Flint tools, animal bones, wood, and antler preserve fragments of their lives. Among them are the strange deer skulls, still carrying the antlers that made them so unusual. The cairn of Barnenes. The monument stands in Brittany, near the northern coast of France. It was built during the Neolithic period, at a time when farming communities were spreading across Western Europe. These people did not have metal tools. They had no written language, and they had no machines capable of lifting enormous stones. Yet they created a monument measuring roughly 70 meters long and containing thousands of tons of stone. Barnes was not built as a single chamber. It is actually a complex of several passage graves, built beside one another. The earliest sections date to around 4,500 BC, while later additions were constructed centuries afterward. This means the monument was not the work of a single generation. Different communities returned to the same location, expanded it, and continued using the monument long after its first construction. Inside the cairn are narrow passages leading into burial chambers. The builders carefully arranged large stones to create the walls, then covered the structures with layers of smaller stones and earth. From the outside, the result looked like a massive artificial hill. But inside, the passages lead deep into darkness. The architecture is simple, yet remarkably sophisticated for its age. Some of the stones used in the monument are enormous. Moving them would have required large groups of people working together. The builders had no carts pulled by machines, no cranes, and no modern lifting equipment. They relied on timber, rope, levers, and coordinated human effort. The exact methods remain uncertain, but the monument demonstrates that Neolithic communities were capable of organizing substantial construction projects. The interior chambers were connected with burial practices. Human remains were placed inside. along with objects such as pottery, stone tools, and other artifacts. Some of the chambers also contain carved stones. These markings include simple geometric patterns and symbols whose meanings are no longer understood. They provide a rare glimpse into the beliefs of the people who built the monument. The decorated stones are among Barnenes's most intriguing features. Some carry repeated patterns, curved lines, axes, and other abstract designs. They are not written language, so there is no way to read them like an inscription. Instead, they appear to belong to a symbolic tradition shared by other prehistoric monuments in the region. Exactly what these symbols represented remains unknown. The monument also tells us something about Neolithic society. Building Barnenes required planning. Stone had to be selected, transported, and positioned. Food had to support the workers. Tools had to be produced, and the construction had to be organized across a large community. This suggests a society capable of cooperation on a remarkable scale. The people who built Barnenes were farmers, but they were also engineers, builders, and organizers. For thousands of years, the monument remained part of the landscape. Weather slowly covered its stones with soil and vegetation. Generations passed, and the people who built it disappeared. Eventually, the original purpose of the monument was forgotten. Barnenes became simply another hill in the Breton countryside. Its true age was hidden beneath the surface. The site was rediscovered and investigated in the 20th century. At one point, parts of the monument were even threatened by modern quarrying. Stone was being removed from the structure before archaeologists recognized the importance of what remained. Excavation and conservation work eventually protected the monument, allowing researchers to study its chambers and construction. The discovery revealed just how old Barnenes really was. It predates many of Europe's famous prehistoric monuments and was constructed thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt. That comparison helps put its age into perspective. When Barnenes was already standing, Egypt's Great Pyramids were still thousands of years in the future. The people who built it belonged to a completely different world. Yet they were capable of monumental construction. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of Barnenes. The monument was not created for practical survival. It was not a house, a fortress, or a storage building. It required enormous effort, but its purpose appears to have been connected with the dead, memory, and ritual. The builders were investing their labor in something that would outlast them. The surrounding landscape was also important. Barnenes stands near the sea, with wide views across the Breton countryside. The monument would have been visible from a considerable distance. Its size made it a permanent landmark, a structure that could connect the living community with the memory of earlier generations. It may have served as a place of burial, ceremony, and remembrance. One of the mysteries is how the monument was used over such a long period. The earliest chambers were constructed, then later chambers were added. Different generations returned to the same site, even as their society changed. The monument, therefore, became a physical record of changing traditions. Its stones preserve not one moment, but centuries of prehistoric activity. Modern archaeologists continue studying Barnenes, using excavation, architectural analysis, and scientific dating. Researchers can examine the stonework, the burial remains, and the objects left inside. Each discovery helps explain how the monument was built and how it was used. But many questions remain. We do not know exactly who was buried there, or what ceremonies took place inside. The carved symbols create an even deeper mystery. Their shapes are clear, but their meanings are not. They may have represented objects, beliefs, animals, or ideas connected with death and ritual. Without a written explanation, their interpretation remains uncertain. The stones can be studied, but they cannot speak. The ancient wine of Godin Tepe. Godin Tepe lies in the Kangavar Valley, among the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. The site was occupied for thousands of years, with different communities leaving their mark on the mound. Archaeological excavations began in the 1960s, and researchers eventually identified numerous layers representing different periods of occupation. One of the most important was known as Period V, dating roughly to the late 4th millennium BC. This was a time when long-distance trade was expanding across the ancient Near East. The settlement contained a large fortified complex, with a central courtyard, storage areas, buildings, and an enclosing wall. Its pottery and other objects showed strong connections with the wider world of the late Uruk period, including southern Mesopotamia. Göbekli Tepe stood in an important location, between the lowlands of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. People, goods, ideas, and technologies could move through this region, and among those goods, there appears to have been wine. The evidence came from large ceramic vessels. Some of the jars were roughly 60 centimeters high and could hold around 30 liters. Others were even larger. Chemical analysis revealed residues associated with wine. Researchers identified compounds connected with grapes, providing evidence that the vessels had once contained fermented grape liquid. The jars were not simply ordinary storage containers. They appear to have been part of a system for storing valuable beverages. One unusual detail makes the discovery even more interesting. Wine residue was found along the sides of some vessels, rather than only at the bottom. This suggests that certain jars may have been stored on their sides. The position would have made sense for long-term storage, especially if the containers were sealed. The vessels could remain protected inside storage rooms, waiting to be opened when the contents were needed. Nearby, archaeologists discovered large basins containing traces associated with wine production. These may have been connected with processing grapes, although their exact function remains debated. If grapes were crushed in such containers, the liquid could then have been transferred into large storage jars. The basic process would have been simple. Grapes were collected, crushed, fermented, and stored. But the archaeological evidence shows that this process was already organized on a significant scale. Wine was not the only fermented drink at Göbekli Tepe. Evidence also points to beer. This is important because the ancient Near East had a long tradition of brewing. At Göbekli Tepe, both beverages appear to have existed within the same broader period. The discovery, therefore, provides a glimpse into a world where fermentation was already an established technology. People understood that certain foods and liquids could be transformed, stored, and consumed in different ways. The discovery also raises a larger question. Why was wine being produced here? The Zagros Mountains were naturally suited to wild grapevines. The surrounding region contains areas where grapes could grow, providing a potential local source. But Göbekli Tepe was also connected to wider trade networks. Wine may have been produced locally, traded from nearby communities, or processed and stored as part of a larger exchange system. The evidence does not give us a single answer. The jars themselves reveal something about the importance of storage. A 30-liter container is far larger than something intended for a single meal. These vessels were designed to hold substantial quantities. That suggests planning, production, and perhaps communal consumption. Wine may have been used during gatherings, feasts, religious activities, or important social occasions. We cannot know exactly how every jar was used, but the scale of the containers suggests that the beverage had significance beyond ordinary household drinking. Göbekli Tepe was also connected with an extraordinary world of trade. Objects discovered at the site show links with regions far beyond the immediate valley. Pottery styles, seals, writing-related objects, and other materials connect the settlement with the expanding networks of the late 4th millennium BC. This was a period when distant communities were becoming increasingly connected. Göbekli Tepe stood within those networks, at a crossroads between different cultural worlds. That makes the wine discovery even more valuable. A jar of ancient residue might seem like a small archaeological detail, but it tells us about agriculture, trade, storage, technology, and social life. Grapes had to be available. Containers had to be produced. The liquid had to be processed. The jars had to be stored. And people had to value the finished product enough to preserve it. A single residue can therefore reveal an entire chain of activity. The discovery also helps place the history of wine into a much longer timeline. Wine is often associated with later civilizations, the Greeks, the Romans, and the great wine traditions of the Mediterranean. But those cultures inherited a much older history. The evidence from the Zagros shows that grape wine was already part of human life thousands of years earlier. Göbekli Tepe is one important chapter in that story. There is also an important distinction between Göbekli Tepe and the even older evidence from nearby sites. At Haji Firuz Tepe, chemical evidence indicates wine production as early as around 5,400, 5000 BC. Göbekli Tepe is later, but it provides important evidence from another community and another period. Together, these sites show that winemaking in the Zagros was not an isolated event. It belonged to a much broader tradition that developed across the region. For the people of Godin Tepe, wine was probably not simply a drink. Fermentation required knowledge, storage required planning, and producing enough wine to fill large jars required access to grapes and labor. The process connected agriculture with craft production, and perhaps with trade and social ceremonies. The jars therefore represent much more than their contents. They are evidence of an organized society. Eventually, the community that occupied the Great Period V complex disappeared. The buildings were abandoned, and later populations transformed the site. Godin Tepe continued to be occupied through several later periods, each leaving another layer over the earlier settlement. The wine jars eventually became part of the buried archaeological record. For thousands of years, their contents were gone. Only the chemical traces remained. Modern scientific analysis finally revealed what those traces represented. The discovery was a reminder of how much information can survive without the original object being intact. The wine itself disappeared long ago. The grapes were gone. The people who made it were gone. Even the smell and taste of the ancient drink are impossible to recover. But the residues remained inside the pottery, waiting to be identified. The 5,000-year-old floor made of ancient concrete. More than 5,000 years ago, people in what is now northwestern China were already experimenting with building materials. At the Dadiwan archaeological site in Gansu province, researchers uncovered something unexpected: a large prehistoric floor made from a hardened mixture that resembles concrete. It was smooth, strong, and remarkably durable. For a long time, concrete was strongly associated with much later civilizations. But Dadiwan provides evidence that prehistoric builders in China were already creating cement-like flooring thousands of years ago. Dadiwan was occupied for thousands of years. The site contains remains from several prehistoric periods, including structures dating back around 8,000 years. But one of its most impressive discoveries came from a large building known as F901. The building dates to roughly 5,000 years ago and was unusually large for its time. It covered around 420 square meters, with a carefully organized layout and several connected spaces. Inside, archaeologists found the remarkable floor. The surface was not simply packed earth. Researchers found that the material contained mineral and lime-based components, creating a hard, artificial surface. Studies of Dadiwan flooring have identified mixtures involving lime, clay, and aggregate materials. The result was strong enough to survive thousands of years beneath the ground. It was not modern Portland cement, but the basic idea was surprisingly familiar. Take different materials, combine them, and create a harder surface for construction. The floor would have provided several advantages. A hard surface was easier to keep clean than ordinary earth. It was more resistant to moisture, and it created a stable surface inside a large building. For a prehistoric community, that would have been a significant improvement. The builders did not need modern engineering formulas. They only needed to understand which materials worked together and how those materials behaved after processing. What makes Dadiwan especially interesting is the scale of the construction. This was not simply a small patch of hardened ground. The main floor of F901 covered a substantial area. The building itself was carefully planned, with a symmetrical layout and multiple rooms. Its size suggests that the structure had an important communal or ceremonial function, rather than being an ordinary small household. The people who created it lived thousands of years before China's famous imperial dynasties. There were no large cities like those of later periods. There was no written history explaining the building, yet the architecture shows organized labor, planning, and an understanding of materials. Large construction projects require coordination. Stone and earth had to be collected. Building materials had to be prepared, workers had to shape the structure, and the floor had to be carefully laid. Dadiwan also produced many other important discoveries. Archaeologists found pottery, tools, agricultural remains, and evidence of increasingly complex settlement life. The site shows how communities in this region gradually developed more sophisticated ways of living. The ancient floor fits into that larger story. It was one part of a much broader process of architectural experimentation. The word concrete needs some caution here. The prehistoric material was not identical to the concrete used today. Modern concrete depends on Portland cement and carefully controlled industrial production. The Dadiwan material was much simpler, using locally available ingredients and prehistoric processing methods. Calling it ancient concrete is therefore a useful comparison, but not a claim that these builders had modern cement technology. Still, the basic achievement is impressive. Someone thousands of years ago discovered that certain materials could be processed, combined, and transformed into a hard artificial surface. That knowledge was preserved through practice, not through written engineering manuals. The builders learned from the landscape around them. They experimented, improved their techniques, and passed useful knowledge from one generation to another. The floor also raises a larger question. How much prehistoric technology has disappeared? Stone tools survive, pottery survives, but many ancient construction materials do not. Wood rots, fibres decay, organic binders disappear. Even floors can eventually break down. At Dadiwan, the conditions allowed an unusual piece of construction history to survive. A surface that once seemed ordinary became archaeological evidence thousands of years later. Today, the remains of Dadiwan provide a window into prehistoric China. The ancient floor is quiet, flat, and easy to overlook. But beneath that simple surface, there is evidence of experimentation, organization, and architectural knowledge. The people who built it left no explanation. They simply left the result. The 5,000-year-old floor made of ancient concrete reminds us that technological innovation did not begin with metal tools or written civilizations. Long before later Chinese dynasties, prehistoric builders were already finding ways to improve their buildings. They mixed materials, created stronger surfaces, and constructed spaces large enough to require organized labor. The floor may look simple today, but after 5,000 years, it still preserves the evidence of an idea. That ancient builders were far more inventive than their surviving monuments sometimes suggest. The giant octagon aligned to the moon. The Newark earthworks were built by the Hopewell culture around the first few centuries AD. These communities lived across what is now the eastern United States. Long before European settlement, they built large earthworks for ceremonial and social purposes, often using enormous circular, octagonal, and geometric designs. Newark was among the largest and most sophisticated. The Great Circle and Octagon once formed part of a much larger complex. Today, only portions survive. Modern roads, buildings, and development have changed the landscape dramatically. But the remaining earthworks still reveal the scale of the original construction. The walls rise above the surrounding ground, creating enormous geometric shapes that are difficult to appreciate from the ground. From above, their design becomes much clearer. The Great Circle is remarkably large, measuring roughly 1,200 feet across. The octagon is even more striking. Its walls form 8 enormous sides, creating a shape that looks almost perfectly geometric. The builders had no modern surveying equipment, yet the earthworks show impressive accuracy. The angles, distances, and relationships between different sections appear to have been carefully planned. One of the most fascinating discoveries concerns the moon. Researchers studying the geometry of the Newark earthworks found that the octagon and nearby features correspond closely with important lunar positions. The moon does not rise and set at exactly the same points every night. Its position shifts through a long cycle at certain points. The moon reaches extreme positions along the horizon. The Newark earthworks appear to have been designed with some of these positions in mind. A particularly important alignment occurs with the lunar standstill cycle. This is a long astronomical cycle, taking roughly 18.6 years. During a major lunar standstill, the moon reaches unusually far north and south along the horizon. The octagon appears connected to these extreme lunar positions, especially through its relationship with nearby earthworks. The precision of these alignments is one reason Newark has attracted so much archaeological attention. But the earthworks were not simply an ancient observatory. Their purpose was probably much broader. The Hopewell people used earthworks as ceremonial spaces, places where communities could gather, perform rituals, and interact with important parts of their spiritual world. Astronomy may have been one element of that larger system. The moon could have helped structure ceremonies, seasonal events, or other communal activities. Exactly how remains uncertain. The construction itself was an enormous undertaking. Earth had to be dug, moved, and carefully placed. The builders did not have modern machines. They relied on human labor, wooden tools, baskets, and organized cooperation. The scale of Newark, therefore, tells us something important about Hopewell society. Large numbers of people could work together, plan complex landscapes, and maintain traditions across generations. The earthworks were also connected by raised pathways and other geometric features. Some of these connections have disappeared, but archaeological research has helped reconstruct parts of the original design. The complex was not a collection of unrelated mounds. It was an interconnected landscape. Circles, octagons, walls, and pathways were positioned in relation to one another. The Hopewell culture also produced remarkable artifacts. Archaeologists have discovered finely worked copper objects, mica sheets, stone tools, shell ornaments, and other materials. Some came from sources hundreds of kilometers away. This reveals extensive exchange networks. People living around Newark were connected to communities across a huge area. Ideas, objects, and materials traveled long distances. That wider network makes the astronomical alignments even more interesting. The people who built Newark were not isolated. They belonged to a broader cultural world, with shared traditions and ceremonial practices. The earthworks may therefore reflect knowledge passed between communities, rather than the work of one isolated group, but we still do not know exactly how that knowledge was learned. The moon itself would have been impossible to ignore, for people living without artificial light. The night sky was a major part of everyday life. The moon changed shape, moved across the sky, and returned to familiar positions. Careful observation over generations could reveal patterns. The Newark earthworks may represent the architectural expression of that knowledge. There is an important caution, however. Modern researchers can identify astronomical alignments, but that does not automatically tell us what the builders intended. The geometry is real. The lunar relationships are measurable, but the beliefs behind them remain unknown. We should not assume that the Hopewell people used the earthworks in exactly the same way as a modern observatory. Their understanding of the sky was part of a much larger cultural and spiritual world. Over time, the Hopewell ceremonial centers changed. The earthworks remained, but the people who built them eventually moved away. Centuries passed. Forests grew across parts of the landscape. The original purpose became difficult to understand. Much of the enormous complex was eventually damaged or destroyed by modern development, yet important sections survived. Today, the remaining Newark earthworks provide a rare glimpse into the engineering abilities of ancient North American societies. The enormous walls are still visible, the geometric shapes remain, and the relationship between the octagon and the moon continues to attract researchers. What once looked like simple earth walls has revealed a far more complicated design. The most remarkable part may be the fact that the builders chose earth. They could have created a monument that rose only a few meters, yet its geometry covers an enormous area. The true scale becomes obvious only when viewed from above. The landscape itself became the monument. The mummies still sitting in the open desert. Chowchilla lies near Nazca, in one of the driest regions of the world. The climate is extremely arid, with very little rainfall. That harsh environment became an unexpected protector. Normally, bodies buried in the ground slowly decay, organic materials disappear, and bones eventually become damaged. At Chowchilla, the dry conditions slowed that process dramatically. The desert became a natural preservation chamber. The cemetery was used mainly between roughly the 1st and 9th centuries AD. This was a period when several cultures developed along Peru's southern coast. The people who used Chowchilla buried their dead in carefully prepared graves. Bodies were placed in seated or flexed positions, then wrapped in layers of textiles. Some were placed inside large burial bundles. Others were buried with objects that may have been important to them during life. The burial position is one of the first things visitors notice. Many of the preserved individuals are sitting with their knees drawn toward the body. Their arms may rest across the chest or legs. The body was then wrapped tightly, creating a compact burial bundle. This was not simply a way of disposing of the dead. The preparation required time, materials, and deliberate care. It suggests that burial was an important part of the community's traditions. The desert also preserved details that would normally disappear. Hair remains visible on some individuals. Pieces of textile survive. Leather, plant fibers, and other organic materials have also been found. These fragile remains provide information about clothing, craftsmanship, and burial practices. The mummies therefore tell archaeologists much more than what happened after death. They reveal details about the lives of the people themselves. Some graves contained pottery, others contained gourds, tools, food remains, or personal objects. These offerings may have been intended for the deceased, or connected with ceremonies surrounding burial. Their exact meaning is uncertain, but the presence of these objects shows that the dead were not treated as meaningless remains. They continued to have a place within the community. The cemetery also suffered from looting. For centuries, burial sites along the Peruvian coast were targeted by grave robbers searching for valuable objects. Many graves were disturbed, and some remains were moved. This makes archaeological interpretation more difficult. A burial found today may not always look exactly as it did when it was originally created. Still, enough survived to reveal the importance of the cemetery. The preservation at Xochilla is particularly striking because of the contrast with the surrounding landscape, outside the graves. There is almost nothing, dry earth rock, and endless desert inside the burial chambers. There are traces of people who lived more than 1,000 years ago. The environment that makes the desert difficult for modern life helped preserve this ancient community. The textiles are especially valuable. Peruvian coastal cultures were highly skilled at weaving. Different fibers and techniques were used to create clothing and burial materials. Even fragments can reveal how fabric was produced, what materials were available, and how communities expressed identity through clothing. At Xochilla, the desert preserved some of these fragile materials far better than wetter archaeological environments could. The cemetery also provides clues about the relationship between the living and the dead. Burial required preparation. The body had to be positioned, wrapped, and placed into the grave. Objects could be added. The grave could then be covered. These actions formed a ritual process. Even without written records, the arrangement of the burials shows that death was treated as an important social event. But many questions remain. Why were some individuals buried with particular objects? Did different burial arrangements represent differences in status? Were certain people more important than others? And what did the seated position mean to the people who created these burials? Archaeologists can examine the physical evidence, but the beliefs behind it are much harder to recover. The cemetery also helps researchers understand ancient life on Peru's southern coast. The region was dry, but not empty. People developed communities around rivers and other sources of water, growing crops, raising animals, fishing, and trading across the coast and highlands. The desert was not simply a wasteland. It was a landscape that required careful adaptation. The people who used Xochilla understood that environment extremely well. They knew where water could be found, where crops could grow, and where the dead could be safely buried. The dry desert may have made life difficult, but it also created conditions that protected their burial traditions for centuries. Over time, the community that used the cemetery disappeared. New cultures emerged, political systems changed, and the original meaning of Xochilla became forgotten. The graves remained beneath the desert. Wind moved across the surface. Sand accumulated, and the cemetery slowly became part of the landscape. Modern archaeology eventually revealed the scale of what had survived. Researchers could study the mummies, the textiles, the pottery, and the burial structures. Each grave added another piece to the history of Peru's ancient coastal communities. The cemetery became an important archaeological site, and conservation efforts have helped protect the remaining burials. Today, some of the graves remain visible beneath the open sky. The mummies sit inside low stone or earthen burial chambers, surrounded by the same dry landscape that protected them. There is something unusual about seeing human remains preserved in such an exposed environment. There is no massive tomb, no enormous pyramid, no elaborate monument rising above the desert, just simple graves, and people who were carefully placed inside them long ago. The mummies still sitting in the open desert reveal a very different side of ancient Peru. The people who used Xochilla did not leave behind enormous stone monuments. Instead, they left their dead, their textiles, their pottery, and small traces of everyday life. The desert preserved those remains almost perfectly in places, allowing modern archaeologists to look across more than 1,000 years of history. The people themselves are gone. Their world has changed completely. But beneath the dry Peruvian sky, their burial traditions still remain. The palace covered in 250 stone masks. Caba was an important Maya center in the Puke region of Yucatan. The city flourished especially during the late Classic period, when Maya architecture across the region reached an extraordinary level of detail. Unlike the towering pyramids of some Maya cities, Caba is famous for its elaborate stone decoration. Buildings were covered with geometric patterns, carved figures, and repeated masks. The Cod's Pop is perhaps the best-known example. The building is sometimes called the Palace of the Masks, because its facade contains rows of large stone masks. Many of these represent chalk,
The Maya rain deity, Shak was associated with rain, thunder, storms, and the water that agriculture depended upon.
In the dry landscape of Yucatan, rain was not simply useful, it was essential. The masks have large eyes, prominent noses, and wide open mouths. Their appearance is striking, especially when hundreds of individual stone elements are seen together. The repeated faces create the impression that the entire building is alive with supernatural figures. But these were not random decorations. The placement of the masks was carefully planned. The architecture itself became a religious statement. The Cod's Pop was constructed using a technique known as mosaic stonework, instead of carving every design from a single massive block. Maya builders produced many individual pieces. These pieces were shaped, then fitted together like a giant stone puzzle. The method required considerable skill. Every element had to fit the next, creating complex patterns across the walls. From a distance, the individual pieces merge into one enormous design. This style of architecture became a defining feature of the Puuc region. Other Maya cities developed different architectural traditions, but Puuc buildings became famous for their intricate geometric decoration. Kaba, Uxmal, Sayal, and other nearby centers shared related styles. The buildings show that these communities were connected through artistic traditions, and probably through political and cultural relationships. The rain masks were particularly important. Yucatan has no major surface rivers across much of the peninsula. Water was often collected in natural limestone wells known as cenotes, and stored in artificial reservoirs. Rainfall was therefore central to survival. The repeated image of chalk on the palace may have been a way of placing the power of rain directly onto the building. The palace became covered with the deity who controlled the water the community needed. The masks also create an unusual visual effect. Their enormous faces project outward from the walls, almost as if the figures are emerging from the architecture. Some appear stacked above others, creating long vertical sequences. The effect would have been even stronger when the building was freshly finished. The stone would have been clean, the details sharply defined, and the surfaces likely decorated with color. Much of that color has disappeared, but the carved forms remain. The Cod's Pop was not an ordinary residence. Its scale and decoration suggest that it had an important ceremonial or elite function. The surrounding complex contains plazas, platforms, and other monumental structures. Together, they formed part of the political and religious center of Kaba. The people who entered these spaces would have encountered architecture designed to communicate power. The palace did not need an inscription explaining its importance. The building itself made the statement. Kaba was also connected with a larger network of Maya cities. A raised stone road, known as a sakbe, connected Kaba with nearby Uxmal. These roads were carefully constructed and raised above the surrounding landscape. Their existence shows that the cities of the Puuc region were not isolated settlements. They were connected by movement, trade, politics, and shared traditions. The builders of Kaba worked without modern machinery. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, and fitted into place. The mosaic masks required hundreds of individual pieces. Each one had to be positioned correctly. A mistake in one section could affect the pattern around it. The finished facade, therefore, represents enormous amounts of organized labor. But the most interesting question may be why chalk appears so many times. The repetition is almost overwhelming, face after face, mouth after mouth, eyes staring outward from the stone. It may have emphasized the importance of rain, or created a protective supernatural presence around the building. The exact religious meaning remains difficult to reconstruct. The Maya left written inscriptions, but they did not leave simple explanations for every architectural design. The masks were also part of a much wider Maya tradition. Chak appears in many forms throughout Maya art. His distinctive features can be recognized across monuments, ceramics, and architectural decoration. The image could therefore communicate ideas understood by people across the region. At Kaba, those ideas were transformed into architecture. The deity was no longer simply carved on an object. He became part of the building itself. Over time, Kaba declined. The reasons are still debated. Political changes, environmental pressures, changing trade networks, and other factors may have contributed. The city was eventually abandoned, and vegetation spread across its monumental buildings. The palace remained hidden within the landscape. Stone survived, but the people who built it disappeared. Centuries later, archaeologists began documenting the ruins. The surviving structures revealed the extraordinary level of craftsmanship that had once existed at Kaba. The Cod's Pop immediately stood out, even in a damaged condition. The masks remained recognizable. Rows of carved faces continued covering the walls,
giving the building an appearance unlike almost any other Maya structure. Today, the palace stands among the trees of Yucatan.
Surrounded by the remains of the ancient city, many of the original details have weathered. Some stones are missing. The colors have faded, but the masks remain. Hundreds of carved elements still preserve the basic design created by Maya builders more than 1,000 years ago. The building is also a reminder of how different ancient architecture could look when it was finished. Modern visitors see pale, weathered limestone. The original inhabitants may have seen something very different: brightly painted surfaces, strong colors, and enormous supernatural faces covering the walls. The palace would have been far more visually dramatic than the ruins we see today. The clay bison of Tuc-Doduber. Tuc-Doduber is located in the Ariège region of southwestern France, inside the Pyrenees. The cave is part of a larger underground network, filled with chambers, passages, and prehistoric artwork. But the clay bison are different from most famous cave paintings. They were not painted onto a wall. They were actually built from wet clay, using the hands of prehistoric artists. The two bison sit close together, their bodies modeled with surprising detail. The artists shaped the heads, horns, shoulders, bodies, and legs using the natural clay available inside the cave. Even after thousands of years, the forms remain recognizable. The animals appear to be facing in the same direction, almost as though they are moving together through the darkness. What makes the discovery even more remarkable is where the sculptures were placed. They were not created near the cave entrance. To reach them, people had to travel deep underground. The cave becomes darker, narrower, and more difficult to navigate. Eventually, the passage leads into a hidden chamber. That is where the bison were found. This raises an obvious question. Why would prehistoric people travel so far underground? Just to create two small clay animals. There was no sunlight inside, no comfortable working space, and no obvious practical reason for making the sculptures. The effort suggests that the location itself was important. Perhaps the cave had a ceremonial meaning. Or perhaps the artists were creating images for a purpose we can no longer understand. The bison themselves show impressive observation. The artists understood the shape of the animals, the position of their horns, and the proportions of their bodies. They did not simply create generic four-legged creatures. They were clearly attempting to represent real animals. Bison were important animals in the prehistoric European environment, and they appear frequently in Paleolithic art. The artists also used the natural surface of the cave. The clay sculptures were placed against the ground, and the surrounding darkness became part of the experience. There was no large open gallery like a modern museum. The figures existed inside a hidden underground world. Visitors would have needed fire or another source of light, and the flickering illumination would have changed the appearance of the animals. The sculptures may have looked very different under prehistoric firelight. The discovery of the bison happened in 1912, when the cave was explored by Henri and Henriette Beguen and their children. The family entered parts of the cave that had remained inaccessible for generations. Deep inside, they discovered prehistoric engravings, footprints, and eventually the extraordinary clay sculptures. The discovery revealed that the cave contained much more than ordinary archaeological remains. It preserved an entire underground artistic environment. Tuc-Doduber also contains engravings of animals, including bison, horses, and other figures. Some were scratched directly into the cave walls. Others were created using different techniques. This combination shows how flexible Paleolithic artists could be. They used whatever surfaces and materials were available: rock, clay, bone, and other natural materials. The clay bison are especially unusual because unfired clay normally does not survive for thousands of years. It can crack, collapse, or disappear completely. Inside Tuc-Doduber, the protected cave environment helped preserve the sculptures. The figures were never fired like pottery. They simply remained in the chamber, undisturbed for thousands of years. That makes their survival extraordinary. The artists also left traces of themselves. Finger impressions and marks from the hands can sometimes be seen in prehistoric clay work. These details create a direct connection with the people who made the sculptures. There was no modern tool separating the artist from the material. Their hands shaped the clay, pressed the surface, and created the final forms. The physical gestures survived long after the people themselves disappeared. But the biggest mystery remains their purpose. Were the bison connected with hunting? Were they part of a ritual? Did the underground chamber have a sacred meaning? Or were the sculptures created simply as an artistic expression? Archaeologists cannot answer these questions with certainty.
There are no written records, no explanation, and no surviving tradition telling us what the figures meant.
The location provides an important clue. Paleolithic cave art is often found in difficult-to-reach areas. Some images were placed deep inside caves, far from ordinary living spaces. This suggests that certain parts of caves may have had special significance. The darkness itself may have been important. The journey underground could have been part of the experience. For the people who entered Tukdodbur, the cave would have been completely different from the world outside. There were no electric lights, no paths, no signs, only darkness, rock, and the small circle of light created by fire. The sound of footsteps would echo through the passages. The sculptures would slowly appear as the light moved across them. It must have been a powerful environment. The bison were created during the Magdalenian period, a time when prehistoric art in Western Europe reached an extraordinary level of complexity. Artists created engravings, paintings, sculptures, and decorated objects. The surviving works show a deep familiarity with animals, but they also demonstrate that prehistoric people were capable of creating art in places that required considerable effort to reach. Eventually, the people who used the cave disappeared. The underground chambers became silent. Dust settled across the floor. The sculptures remained where they had been placed. Thousands of years passed, and the world outside changed completely. The animals depicted in the cave disappeared from the region, and the communities that created the artwork were forgotten. When the cave was rediscovered, the clay bison provided an extraordinary connection to that lost world. They were not simply pictures of animals. They were physical objects, shaped by human hands. Inside a hidden chamber, the artists could have made their figures from many materials, but they chose the soft clay beneath their feet, and then they left them there. The buried city of Akrotiri, on a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea. An entire ancient town lies beneath layers of ash. Buildings, streets, storage rooms, and beautifully painted walls were buried almost 2,000 years ago before the birth of classical Greece. This is Akrotiri, one of the best preserved prehistoric settlements ever discovered in the Mediterranean. Akrotiri stands on the island of Santorini, known in ancient times as Thera. The settlement belonged to the Minoan Bronze Age world, and was already thriving more than 3,500 years ago. People lived in multi-story buildings, traded across the Aegean, stored food, produced pottery, and decorated their homes with elaborate paintings. It was a sophisticated community. But its location came with a dangerous neighbor, the volcano beneath the island. At some point during the 2nd millennium BC, the inhabitants began leaving. The exact sequence of events is still debated, but the settlement was eventually buried by a massive volcanic eruption. Ash and volcanic material covered the buildings, sealing them beneath the ground. Unlike many ancient cities, Akrotiri was not destroyed and rebuilt by later generations. It was buried, and that made an enormous difference. The volcanic deposits protected objects that would normally disappear. Wooden remains survived in some areas. Food storage containers remained in place. Pottery was left inside rooms, and the walls of buildings were preserved beneath the ash. Archaeologists could therefore see parts of the settlement almost as the inhabitants had left them. There were rooms, doorways, staircases, and streets frozen beneath the volcanic layers. One of the most remarkable features is the wall paintings. The people of Akrotiri decorated their buildings with colorful scenes, showing animals, plants, ships, landscapes, and people. The paintings are unusually detailed. They reveal clothing, architecture, plants, and ships that were part of the world these people knew. They also show that Akrotiri was connected to a much wider Mediterranean network. The famous fleet scenes are especially important. They show ships traveling between coastal settlements, with buildings and landscapes appearing along the shoreline. The paintings provide clues about maritime life, trade, and the importance of the sea. For a community living on an island, the sea was not a barrier. It was a highway. Ships connected Thera with other parts of the Aegean and beyond. The architecture also reveals a sophisticated society. Buildings could have several floors, with carefully planned rooms, staircases, storage areas, and drainage systems. Some streets were paved, and water management was clearly important. The settlement was not a collection of simple huts. It was an organized urban community. Yet there are some striking things missing. Archaeologists have found remarkably few human remains at Akrotiri. There are also no obvious signs of a massive loss of life inside the town. This suggests that many inhabitants may have evacuated before the main eruption reached the settlement. They appear to have recognized that something was wrong and left. But where they went,
and what happened to them afterward is still uncertain. The eruption itself was enormous. It transformed the island and sent volcanic material across the surrounding region. The exact date remains debated, but it occurred during the second millennium BC. The eruption is often associated with the major volcanic event that reshaped Thera. Its effects were felt far beyond the island. Ash spread across parts of the Aegean, and the eruption likely caused major environmental disruption.
Akrotiri also reveals how people adapted to living in a volcanic environment. The island was fertile, surrounded by sea, and positioned along important maritime routes. The inhabitants benefited from those advantages, but they also lived beside an active volcano. The eruption eventually changed the landscape completely. The town disappeared beneath the material released by the mountain. The pottery found at Akrotiri provides additional evidence of trade. Different styles and materials show connections with other Aegean communities. Objects from distant regions reached the island, while Thera's own products could travel outward. This suggests that Akrotiri was part of a large economic network. Its people were not isolated. They were connected to the wider Bronze Age world. The paintings also raise questions about daily life. Some show women wearing elaborate clothing. Others show fishermen, sailors, animals, and landscapes. These scenes are not simply decoration. They provide clues about how the people saw themselves, their environment, and the world beyond the island, but their exact meaning remains difficult to determine. One of the most fascinating discoveries is the presence of preserved food. Storage vessels and other containers were found inside buildings. They provide evidence of agriculture, food preparation, and long-term storage. The eruption effectively sealed these spaces. Instead of being cleared and reused, they were buried. That created an archaeological snapshot of Bronze Age life. The town remained hidden for centuries. The volcanic landscape changed. New communities developed elsewhere, and the ancient settlement was forgotten. Only in the 19th century did archaeological investigations begin revealing traces of ancient activity on Santorini. Later excavations at Akrotiri uncovered the extraordinary settlement beneath the volcanic deposits. Layer by layer, the buried town returned to view. Today, Akrotiri is often compared with Pompeii. Both settlements were preserved by volcanic disasters. But their histories are different. Akrotiri is much older, and its preservation reflects a Bronze Age civilization that existed thousands of years before the Roman world. The comparison is useful, but Akrotiri stands on its own. It provides a rare view of prehistoric urban life in the Aegean. The biggest mystery may be what happened to the people. They appear to have escaped the settlement before the final destruction, but the archaeological record does not clearly tell us where they went. Some may have moved to other islands. Others may have traveled toward mainland Greece. Their descendants may have continued living elsewhere, while the abandoned town remained buried beneath the volcano. The buried city of Akrotiri is remarkable because its greatest story is not about destruction alone, it is about preservation. A thriving Bronze Age community disappeared beneath volcanic ash. But the eruption also protected its streets, its paintings, its buildings, and the objects left behind. More than 3,500 years later, we can still walk through the remains of that lost world and see fragments of a civilization that vanished beneath the shadow of a volcano. The fortress of Motilla del Azuer, in the dry plains of central Spain. A strange stone fortress rises from the landscape. Its walls surround a deep underground well, and inside the enclosure are narrow passages, storage rooms, and carefully planned defensive structures. This is Motilla del Azuer, one of the most unusual prehistoric settlements in Spain. It was built more than 4,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age. Motilla del Azuer lies near Daimiel, in the La Mancha region of central Spain. The landscape is dry today, but thousands of years ago, water was an equally important resource. The people who built the settlement created something remarkable around it, a fortified mound with thick stone walls, towers, and an enormous central well. The water source was protected inside the fortress. The central well is one of the most fascinating parts of the site. It extends deep into the ground, reaching an underground water source. The builders created stairways leading downward, allowing people to reach the water. This was not simply a small household well. The entire defensive complex appears to have been organized around it. Water was valuable, and protecting access to it may have been essential. The fortress was built in several stages. Walls were added, structures were expanded, and different areas developed around the central enclosure. The result became a complicated maze of stone architecture. Narrow entrances made movement easier to control. Thick walls provided protection. and the central water supply remained inside the defended area. It was a practical response to the challenges of the landscape. The people of Motilla del Azuer were part of the Bronze Age communities of La Mancha. They lived from farming, animal husbandry, and other local resources. Archaeologists have found evidence of grain storage, animal remains, pottery, and tools. These discoveries show that the settlement was not simply a military fort. It was a functioning community, with people producing food, storing supplies, and managing valuable resources. The storage areas are particularly interesting. Large ceramic vessels were used to hold agricultural products. Some rooms contained evidence of grain processing. This suggests that food was carefully collected and stored, possibly protecting supplies from both animals and human threats. The fortress therefore served several purposes at once. It protected people, protected food, and most importantly, protected access to water. The design also tells us about the importance of cooperation. Building thick stone walls required labor, digging the deep well required enormous effort, transporting stone, constructing stairways, and maintaining the settlement would have required organized work. This was not a simple temporary camp. It was a permanent investment in a particular location. The well itself is especially impressive. People had to descend deep underground, using stone steps, to reach the water. The builders had to understand the local geology, know where water could be found, and construct a safe route down to it. The result was an underground water system protected within the settlement, for a dry region, that could have been incredibly valuable. The defensive walls may also reflect competition between communities. During the Bronze Age, different settlements across Iberia developed increasingly complex social systems. Resources were important, and controlling them could create tension. A fortified settlement offered protection, but it also required people to maintain the defenses. Motilla del Azuer may therefore reflect a period when security and resource control became increasingly important. One of the mysteries is why so many similar fortified mounds appeared across La Mancha. They are known as motillas, and several have been identified across the region. Many are associated with water sources. This has led archaeologists to consider whether controlling groundwater was one of their main functions. The settlements may have formed part of a wider system, adapted to the dry environment of the region. Motilla del Azuer is especially valuable because of its preservation. Much of the settlement remained buried, protecting the layout of the buildings. Archaeologists can still trace walls, storage areas, workspaces, and the central water structure. The site provides a rare view of how Bronze Age communities organized a fortified settlement around an essential natural resource. The people who lived here did not have modern pumps, concrete, or steel tools. Yet they created a functioning water system deep beneath the ground. They moved through the well using stone steps, collected water, and brought it back into the settlement. The system depended entirely on human labor, but it was carefully designed. Over time, Motilla del Azuer was eventually abandoned. The reasons are not completely understood. Environmental changes, social changes, or changes in how communities managed resources may have played a role. The fortress fell silent, and its walls gradually became part of the surrounding landscape. Centuries passed, and the settlement was forgotten. Modern archaeology revealed something very different beneath the mound. What appeared to be a simple prehistoric hill was actually a carefully constructed fortress. Inside were walls, rooms, storage areas, and the remarkable underground well. The discovery helped researchers understand how Bronze Age communities in central Spain adapted to a difficult environment. The most interesting part may be the relationship between defense and water. A fortress can protect people, a storehouse can protect food, but water is harder to replace. Without it, a settlement cannot survive for long. At Motilla del Azuer, the most valuable resource was placed at the heart of the defensive system. The walls were not simply protecting buildings, they were protecting access to survival itself. The thinker of Hamangia. More than 7,000 years ago, a small clay figure was created in what is now Romania. It shows a seated human figure, with its head lowered, and its hands resting against its face. The posture is strikingly familiar. It looks almost as if the figure is thinking. Today, it is known as the Thinker of Hamangia, and it has become one of the most famous prehistoric sculptures ever discovered in southeastern Europe. The figure was created by the Hamangia culture, a Neolithic community that lived around the western Black Sea. Their settlements were spread across parts of modern Romania and Bulgaria. During the 5th millennium BC, these were farming communities, but they were also skilled craftspeople. They produced pottery, worked stone, made tools, and created small clay figures representing people and animals. The thinker was discovered at the prehistoric cemetery of Cernavoda, along with another remarkable figure known as the sitting woman. The two sculptures were found together, and their relationship has attracted considerable attention. The thinker sits on a small stool-like form, with his elbows resting on his knees. His hands support his head. The pose gives the figure an unusual sense of human emotion, but the name thinker was given in modern times. There is no evidence that the ancient artist intended to represent someone thinking. The figure could have had a completely different meaning. It may have represented a person, a supernatural being, an ancestor, or perhaps something connected with burial rituals. The sculpture itself cannot tell us. Its expression has survived, but its original meaning has not. The material is simple. The figure was made from clay, then carefully shaped by hand. The artist created the body, arms, head, and distinctive seated posture. There is no attempt to make the figure look completely realistic. Instead, the artist emphasized the overall form. The body is simplified, but the pose is remarkably clear. This is what makes the sculpture so interesting. The artist did not need detailed facial features to communicate a human presence. The position of the body does most of the work. The lowered head, bent arms, and supported face create a recognizable posture. Thousands of years later, modern viewers still understand the gesture. That creates an unusual connection across time. The thinker was found in a funerary context. This is important because the meaning of the sculpture may have been connected with death. The Hamangia culture buried its dead in organized cemeteries, sometimes with objects placed alongside them. These objects may have had symbolic or personal significance. The sculpture therefore may not have been ordinary decoration. It could have played a role in a ceremony, or represented ideas about the person being buried. The companion figure, often called the sitting woman, adds another mystery. She sits beside the thinker, with her body also carefully shaped. The two figures are similar in scale, and appear to belong to the same artistic tradition. Their discovery together raises the possibility that they were intentionally connected, but again, we cannot know exactly how. The Hamangia people lived in a changing world. Agriculture had already transformed human life. Communities were becoming more settled. Animals were being domesticated, and pottery was becoming an important part of daily life. Yet life was still demanding. People depended on farming, animal husbandry, fishing, and hunting. The Black Sea region provided a mixture of environments and resources. Their pottery reveals considerable artistic skill. Some vessels were decorated with geometric patterns, while others were carefully shaped into distinctive forms. The same attention to form appears in their clay figurines. These objects were small, but they required careful modeling. The thinker shows that prehistoric artists could create figures with surprisingly expressive poses, even without realistic proportions. The cemetery where the figures were found provides another important clue. Burial was clearly meaningful to the community. The dead were deliberately placed, and the graves were arranged according to traditions. The presence of special objects suggests that ceremonies accompanied some burials, but the exact beliefs behind those rituals remain unknown. There are no written texts from the Hamangia culture. Everything must be reconstructed from the archaeological evidence. This makes the thinker difficult to interpret. Some have suggested that the figure represents contemplation, mourning, or reflection. Others have proposed more symbolic interpretations, but these ideas remain possibilities. The ancient people who made the sculpture did not leave a label explaining what it represented. The modern name is based entirely on its appearance. The sculpture also reminds us that prehistoric art was not always about animals. Across Paleolithic Europe, animals dominate much of the surviving cave art, but later Neolithic communities increasingly created human figures. These figures may have represented individuals, deities, ancestors, or symbolic characters. The thinker belongs to this broader development of human representation. The small size of the sculpture is also interesting. It could easily fit in someone's hands. Unlike a monument, it did not require an enormous amount of material, yet the artist managed to create a figure with a strong visual identity. The posture is immediately recognizable. The simplicity may actually be part of its strength. Over thousands of years, the Hamangia culture disappeared. Later communities settled across the same region. Languages changed, technologies changed, religious traditions changed, but the clay figure survived underground. Its original world vanished, while the sculpture remained buried. When archaeologists recovered it, they could finally study the tiny details left by the ancient artist. The shape of the body, the position of the arms, the modeling of the head, and the relationship between the two figures. These details turned a small clay object into an important piece of European prehistory. The Barbar temples of Dilmun. On a small island in the Persian Gulf, a civilization once built temples around a mysterious sacred well. The ruins are now surrounded by modern Bahrain, but more than 4,000 years ago, this was part of the ancient land of Dilmun. At the site of Barbar, archaeologists uncovered the remains of several temples, built one above another across centuries. The Barbar temples were constructed during the Bronze Age, when Dilmun had become an important center of trade. The island was positioned between Mesopotamia and the wider Gulf, making it a natural stopping point for merchants and ships. Copper from Oman, goods from Mesopotamia, and other materials moved through the region. Dilmun became wealthy from this position. But the Barbar temples reveal another side of the civilization, its religious traditions. The temple complex was built in several phases. Each new structure was constructed over or beside an earlier one. This created layers of architecture, with later builders preserving parts of the older sanctuary. The oldest known temple dates back more than 4,000 years. Over time, the complex was expanded, rebuilt, and modified. The site therefore represents centuries of changing religious activity at the center of the complex. Archaeologists found a deep well. This feature became one of the most important parts of the discovery. The well was carefully constructed and surrounded by stone architecture. Its exact religious purpose remains uncertain. But water appears to have been central to the temple. In a region where fresh water was precious, a sacred spring would have had enormous significance. The temple was not simply a place for people to gather. Its architecture included platforms, stone-lined areas, and carefully arranged spaces. Some parts of the complex may have been used for ceremonies, while others were connected with offerings or ritual activities. The layout suggests that movement through the temple was controlled. Different spaces may have had different purposes. The builders worked mainly with local stone, but they also used other materials brought from elsewhere. The temple's construction required organized labor, planning, and access to resources. The site was not created by a small group working casually. It represented a larger community effort. That tells us something about the organization of Dilmun society. The island's position also helps explain the importance of Barbar. Dilmun was a major trading center during the Bronze Age. Mesopotamian texts mention Dilmun, and archaeological discoveries show connections across the Gulf. Merchants traveled between distant regions, carrying metals, stone, wood, food, and other valuable materials. The temples existed within this busy world of trade. Religion and trade may have been closely connected. Temples could have served as places where communities gathered, where offerings were made, and where important social traditions were maintained. The people who arrived in Dilmun may have encountered both a commercial center and a sacred landscape. The Barbar temples were part of that identity. One of the most fascinating discoveries from the complex is the famous stone bull's head. The small sculpture was found near the temple, and is generally associated with Dilmun's religious culture. Its precise meaning remains uncertain, but bulls were important symbols across the ancient Near East. The sculpture may have represented strength, fertility, or a deity. Again, the surviving evidence does not give us a simple answer. The temple's water system is perhaps even more mysterious. The sacred well was built deep into the ground and carefully incorporated into the architecture. Water may have been used during purification rituals, offerings, or other ceremonies, but archaeologists cannot reconstruct every ritual that took place there. The people of Dilmun left no surviving instructions explaining how the well was used. Eventually, the Barbar temples were abandoned. The reasons are not completely understood. Political changes, economic shifts, and changing religious traditions may have played a role. The buildings gradually fell into ruin. Sand and soil covered parts of the remains, and later communities built across the island. The ancient sanctuary slowly disappeared from view. Modern excavations revealed the temple complex in the 20th century. Archaeologists uncovered the different construction phases, the sacred well, stone platforms, and other remains. The discoveries showed that the site had been used for centuries, with each generation leaving another layer of construction. The temples are especially important because Dilmun itself was once poorly understood. Ancient texts mention the name, but archaeology provided the physical evidence. The ruins of Bahrain showed that Dilmun was not simply a name in Mesopotamian records. It was a real society, with settlements, trade networks, religious centers, and monumental architecture. Barbar became one of the clearest examples. The sacred well also reflects the importance of water in the Gulf. Today,
Modern Bahrain has enormous systems for obtaining and distributing water. 4,000 years ago, the situation was completely different.
Freshwater sources were limited, and controlling access to them could be extremely important. A sacred spring inside a temple would therefore have had both practical and symbolic importance. The exact beliefs of the people who worshipped here remain unknown. We do not know which deity was honored, what ceremonies were performed, or what the sacred well represented to them. The ruins provide clues, but not complete answers. That uncertainty is part of the site's fascination. The tomb guarded by half-woman, half-plant statues, hidden in the countryside of northeastern Bulgaria. A strange ancient tomb stands beneath a low grassy mound. Its entrance is guarded by unusual stone figures, part human, part plant. Their bodies rise from the ground like living pillars. They are known as the caryatids of the Sveshtari tomb, and they are unlike almost anything else found in the ancient Balkans. The tomb was built around the 3rd century BC, during the Hellenistic period. It belonged to the Getae, an ancient Thracian people who lived across parts of southeastern Europe. The Getae were connected to the wider Thracian world, but they also developed their own distinctive traditions. The Sveshtari tomb is one of the clearest examples. The entrance leads into a passage, then into a central chamber. Inside, the walls are decorated with 10 unusual female figures. Each figure appears to stand upright, with raised arms supporting the upper structure. Their lower bodies are not shaped like ordinary human legs. Instead, they gradually transform into plant-like forms. This combination gives the chamber an almost supernatural appearance. The figures are often described as half-woman, half-plant. Their clothing and faces are carefully carved, while their lower bodies become stylized columns. The arrangement is highly unusual. Ancient Greek architecture used human figures as architectural supports, but the Sveshtari sculptures combine that tradition with distinctly local artistic ideas. The result is something rarely seen elsewhere. The tomb itself was not simply a burial pit. It was a carefully planned monument. Large stone blocks were shaped, placed, and covered beneath an enormous earth mound. The interior was divided into several chambers, creating a controlled path from the entrance toward the burial areas. The architecture suggests that the burial was an important event. Someone of considerable status was placed inside. The identity of the person buried here remains uncertain. Archaeologists believe the tomb belonged to an important Getic ruler or member of the elite, but no surviving inscription gives us a definite name. This makes the monument even more mysterious. We know the person was important enough to receive an elaborate burial, but we do not know exactly who they were. The caryatids may have had a symbolic role. Their raised arms appear to support the ceiling, but they may also have represented something beyond architecture. Their plant-like lower bodies could be connected with fertility, nature, life, or transformation. These interpretations remain uncertain. The figures themselves do not explain their meaning. Above the caryatids, the chamber contains a decorated frieze. The carvings include floral and geometric elements, creating a connection between the human figures and the surrounding architecture. The entire chamber seems designed as a unified composition. The people entering the tomb would not have seen isolated statues. They would have entered a carefully arranged symbolic space. Another fascinating feature is the painting. Traces of ancient color survived on parts of the decoration. The tomb was therefore not originally plain white stone. Its surfaces may have been much more vivid when newly completed. The figures, walls, and decorative elements would have appeared very differently under ancient lighting. Over time, most of those colors disappeared. The tomb also shows how cultural traditions could mix. The Geta lived in a region influenced by Greek culture, Thracian traditions, and local beliefs. The architecture reflects this complicated world. The caryatids resemble forms known from Greek art, yet their combination with the tomb's other features is distinctly unusual. The monument is neither simply Greek, nor completely separate from the wider Hellenistic world. The construction itself would have required considerable organization. Stone had to be quarried, transported, cut, and fitted together. The burial chamber needed to remain stable beneath a large mound. Artists then had to carve the figures and decorative surfaces. This required skilled workers, time, and resources. The tomb therefore tells us that the society behind it could support specialized craftsmanship. The surrounding landscape also matters. The tomb was placed beneath a large mound, making it visible as a monument across the countryside. The mound protected the chamber, but it also marked the burial place.
For the community,
the monument may have served as a lasting reminder of the person buried within. It transformed a burial into a permanent part of the landscape. For centuries, the tomb remained hidden. The mound slowly blended into the surrounding countryside. The people who built it disappeared, and their political world changed. The meaning of the statues was eventually forgotten, but the stone chamber remained sealed beneath the earth. The tomb was discovered in the 20th century, and archaeologists were able to enter the chamber and study its remarkable decoration. The discovery revealed an unusually complete Getic burial monument. The caryatids immediately became its most recognizable feature. Their strange forms created a direct connection between architecture, human figures, and nature. One of the biggest questions is what these figures actually represented. Were they goddesses, ancestors, protective spirits, or simply architectural figures inspired by Hellenistic traditions? Different interpretations have been proposed, but there is no definitive answer. Their meaning belonged to a culture that disappeared more than 2,000 years ago. Today, the Sfeștari tomb remains one of the most extraordinary monuments of ancient Thrace. The chamber is quiet. The burial has long been disturbed by time, and the people who once entered it are gone. But the 10 caryatids still stand along the walls, their arms raised, their bodies transforming into plant-like forms. The tomb, guarded by half-woman, half-plant statues, is a reminder that ancient cultures did not always follow familiar architectural traditions. The builders of Sfeștari borrowed ideas from the wider ancient world, then transformed them into something uniquely their own. More than 2,000 years later, the figures still guard the chamber, silent, unmoving, and still carrying a meaning that archaeology has not completely recovered. The bronze bells of Zhengouyi. The tomb was discovered in 1978, near Suizhou in Hubei province. Archaeologists opened a large underground burial complex containing weapons, ceremonial objects, wooden furniture, lacquerware, and hundreds of bronze objects. But the most remarkable discovery was the set of bells. They were found arranged in 3 large groups, hanging from wooden frames. The largest bells were enormous, while smaller bells filled the upper sections. The bells were made around the 5th century BC, during China's Warring States period. This was a time of political competition. Powerful states were fighting for territory, and rulers used elaborate ceremonies to demonstrate their status. Music was an important part of that world. It could accompany ceremonies, state gatherings, religious rituals, and royal events. The collection in Marquis Yi's tomb therefore represented far more than entertainment. It demonstrated wealth, education, and political power. The most surprising feature is the musical precision. Many of the bells can produce 2 different pitches. Depending on where they are struck, one note can be produced near the center, and another near the edge. This gave the musicians an unusually large range of sounds. The complete collection could produce a complex musical scale, allowing ancient performers to play sophisticated melodies. The bells were also carefully arranged according to size and pitch. Large bells produced deeper sounds, while smaller bells produced higher ones. The arrangement created a complete musical ensemble. Ancient musicians could strike the bells with wooden mallets, producing different tones. The tomb therefore preserved not just instruments, but an entire performance system. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The bells were cast from bronze. Using highly controlled manufacturing techniques, the surfaces were decorated with intricate patterns, including geometric designs and small figures. Each bell was carefully shaped, because even small changes could affect its sound. The ancient craftsmen therefore needed to understand both metallurgy and acoustics. The discovery also revealed something about ancient Chinese music. Music was not simply a form of personal entertainment. It was closely connected with political and ceremonial life. A ruler who possessed such an elaborate ensemble was demonstrating authority. The ability to organize musicians, produce instruments, and perform complex compositions reflected the sophistication of the court. The bells were therefore symbols of status as much as musical instruments. Marquis Yi himself appears to have been an important regional ruler. His tomb was constructed on a massive scale. The burial complex contained several chambers, including areas for ritual objects, weapons, and musical instruments. The bells were placed in a dedicated chamber, where their wooden frames could be reconstructed from the archaeological remains. The arrangement was so carefully preserved that researchers could understand how the ensemble was originally displayed. Other instruments were found alongside the bells. These included drums, stone chimes, flutes, and string instruments. Together, they created an enormous musical collection. This suggests that the court of Marquis Yi maintained a highly organized musical tradition.
The bells were only one part of a much larger orchestra. One of the most fascinating aspects of the discovery is that the instruments were buried rather than simply destroyed or discarded. The ruler appears to have wanted these objects to accompany him into the afterlife. That reflects ancient Chinese beliefs about death, where important possessions could continue to have meaning beyond the grave. The tomb became a miniature version of the ruler's world. Weapons, furniture, musical instruments, and ceremonial objects were all included. The bells also carry inscriptions. These provide valuable information about their manufacture, measurements, and musical relationships. The inscriptions help researchers understand how ancient Chinese musicians organized pitch. This is extremely important, because written musical theory from this period is rare. The bells themselves became a physical record of ancient musical knowledge. Their discovery changed ideas about ancient technology. It is easy to imagine ancient instruments as simple objects, but the Zeng bells demonstrate a much higher level of precision. The craftsmen needed consistent bronze casting, accurate shapes, and careful tuning. The result was a collection of instruments that could still produce recognizable musical intervals more than 2,000 years later. The tomb also demonstrates the importance of organized labor. Casting more than 100 large bronze bells required huge quantities of metal, skilled craftsmen, molds, fuel, and workers. The bells then had to be transported, decorated, tuned, and installed. This was a major undertaking. Only a powerful society could support such a project. Eventually, the state of Zheng disappeared. Political power shifted across China, wars changed borders, and the tomb was sealed beneath the earth. The music stopped. The bells remained silent for more than 2,000 years. Their wooden frames decayed, but the bronze survived. When archaeologists opened the tomb, they found the bells still arranged in their ancient positions. The discovery created an extraordinary opportunity. Researchers could examine the instruments directly, study their inscriptions, measure their pitches, and reconstruct how the ensemble had been used. Ancient Chinese music was no longer only something described in historical texts. Part of the actual equipment had survived. Today, the bells of Marquis Yi are among the most important musical artifacts from ancient China. They show how closely music, technology, and political power were connected. The bells were beautiful, but their true importance lies in what they reveal about the society that created them. We cannot hear the exact performance that took place more than 2,000 years ago, but the instruments survived. Their bronze surfaces still carry the marks of their craftsmen. Their inscriptions still preserve ancient information, and their different tones can still be produced. For a moment, the distance between the modern world and ancient China becomes surprisingly small. The temple the jungle swallowed whole. Deep inside the forests of Cambodia, a massive stone temple sits almost completely surrounded by jungle. Trees grow beside its walls, roots twist through ancient stones, and collapsed galleries disappear beneath vegetation. This is Bang Melia, a forgotten Khmer temple that gives the impression of a monument slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Bang Melia was built during the Khmer Empire, probably during the 12th century. It lies east of Angkor, far from the most famous temples of Cambodia. The temple was constructed from sandstone, with long galleries, courtyards, libraries, and enormous entrance structures. Its original plan was carefully organized, but much of that design is difficult to see today. Centuries of collapse and vegetation have transformed the site. The temple was surrounded by a large moat and approached through a long causeway. Visitors would once have crossed this approach toward the main sanctuary. The causeway connected the temple with the surrounding landscape, creating a formal entrance to the sacred complex. But today, many sections are broken. Huge stones lie scattered across the ground, and trees have grown directly among the ruins. Bang Melia was part of the same architectural world as Angkor. Its design shares features with major Khmer temples, including long galleries, tower structures, and carefully arranged courtyards. The builders created a complex religious landscape, not simply a single building. The temple was designed to guide people through different spaces, moving from the outer areas toward the sacred center. The sandstone construction required enormous effort. Blocks had to be quarried, transported, cut, and placed into position. The walls were decorated with carvings, some showing religious figures and mythological scenes. Many details have been damaged, but traces of the original craftsmanship remain. The collapsed stones still reveal the precision of the builders. One of the most striking things about Bang Melia is how much of the temple has collapsed. Huge blocks are piled across the courtyards. Broken galleries form narrow passages. Stairways lead toward fallen structures,
and sections of the temple appear almost frozen in the moment of destruction. The ruins are not completely reconstructed. Much of the atmosphere comes from seeing the temple in its damaged state. The jungle has become part of the monument. Roots pass between stones, branches cover sections of walls, and vegetation grows across collapsed roofs. The forest did not destroy the temple instantly. Instead, it slowly surrounded it, year after year. Plants grew, stones shifted, and the boundaries between architecture and nature became harder to separate. The temple's isolation also helped preserve its atmosphere. Unlike the most famous monuments of Angkor, Bang Milea remained relatively remote for much of its modern history. The jungle gradually concealed the ruins. Local people knew of the site, but much of the wider world had little awareness of it. The temple became almost a hidden monument within the Cambodian forest. Its original purpose was religious. The Khmer Empire built temples as sacred centers, often connected with Hindu traditions, and later, in many places, Buddhism. Bang Milea contains architectural features associated with Hindu temple design. The central sanctuary would have been the most sacred part of the complex, but much of that structure has collapsed. The temple also reveals how powerful the Khmer Empire had become. Building such a complex required resources: workers, engineers, stone carvers, and administrators. Large temples were not isolated projects. They were supported by surrounding communities, agriculture, trade, and systems of labor. Bang Milea therefore represents more than religious architecture. It reflects the organization of an enormous empire. The exact history of the temple is still incomplete. Inscriptions and architectural evidence provide clues, but many details remain uncertain. We do not know exactly how daily life unfolded here, how many people regularly visited, or precisely when every part of the complex was constructed. The ruins preserve the physical structure, but not the voices of the people who used it. Over the centuries, the Khmer Empire changed. Political centers shifted, religious traditions evolved, and some major temples were gradually abandoned. Bang Milea eventually lost its original importance. Without regular maintenance, the buildings began to deteriorate. The jungle moved into the abandoned spaces. By the time modern researchers studied the ruins, the temple had become heavily overgrown. Many structures were difficult to navigate. Collapsed stones covered large sections of the site. Vegetation hid carvings, walls, and pathways. The result was a monument that looked less like a restored archaeological site and more like a city being slowly reclaimed by nature. Conservation work has made parts of Bang Milea easier to explore. Wooden walkways and paths allow visitors to move through sections of the ruins, but the site still retains much of its collapsed character. The goal is not simply to rebuild every wall. Some of the ruins remain exactly where they fell, showing the temple as an archaeological landscape. The relationship between the forest and the temple is what makes Bang Milea so distinctive. At some sites, nature is carefully removed to reveal the architecture. Here, the two remain closely connected. Trees grow from the ruins, roots wrap around stones, and sunlight passes through the canopy onto ancient walls. The forest almost becomes another layer of the monument. The temple also shows how quickly human construction can disappear. The Khmer builders created enormous stone structures, expecting them to endure for centuries. They did. But without people maintaining the buildings, vegetation slowly changed the site. Walls collapsed, roofs disappeared, and pathways became hidden. The jungle did not need centuries of destruction. It only needed time. Today, Bang Milea remains one of Cambodia's most atmospheric ancient temples. The stone is weathered, the carvings are damaged, and many structures remain in ruins. But that broken appearance is exactly what makes the site so memorable. It gives a sense of what an abandoned Khmer monument might look like after centuries without human care. The temple the jungle swallowed whole is not simply a story about a lost building. It is a story about what happens when architecture is left to nature. The Khmer builders created a massive sacred complex. People worshipped there. Workers maintained it, and generations passed through its gates. Then the people disappeared. The temple fell silent, and the forest slowly returned. Today, Bang Milea still stands beneath the trees, a massive monument from the Khmer Empire, partly built by humans and partly transformed by the jungle. The stone monument beneath the water. For thousands of years, a circle of enormous stones stood in the Spanish countryside. Then the landscape changed. Water covered the site, and the ancient monument disappeared beneath a reservoir. This is the Guadalperol Dolmen, a prehistoric stone monument in western Spain that has become known as the Spanish Stonehenge. The monument was built more than 5,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period.
Its builders arranged large stones into a megalithic structure, creating a long passage that led toward a central chamber. The stones were not simply scattered across the landscape. They were deliberately positioned, creating a carefully planned monument for the dead. Guadalperol is located near the Tagus River.
In the province of Cáceres, the monument was discovered in the 20th century, but for decades, it remained largely hidden beneath the waters of the Valdecañas reservoir. Most of the time, only a few stones could be seen. Then drought changed everything. As the water level dropped, the ancient stones began appearing again. The sight was extraordinary. A monument that had been underwater for decades suddenly returned to the landscape. Stone after stone emerged from the mud. The ancient passage became visible, and the outline of the burial monument could once again be seen. For archaeologists, it was an unusual opportunity. The reservoir had hidden the site, but it had also protected parts of it from modern development. The structure is a dolmen, a type of megalithic monument found across parts of prehistoric Europe. Large upright stones formed the walls, while massive slabs were placed above them. At Guadalperol, the arrangement created a long corridor leading toward the burial chamber. The people who built it had to move heavy stones, position them carefully, and cover the structure with earth. The monument was probably connected with burial and ritual activity. Human remains and other archaeological evidence have been associated with the site. The chamber may have served as a collective burial place, where members of a community were laid to rest over time. The monument therefore had a purpose beyond simple construction. It created a permanent place for remembering the dead. One of the most interesting stones is a decorated upright slab. It contains markings that have attracted considerable attention. The surface includes what appears to be a human-like figure, along with other engraved patterns. The exact meaning is unknown. The markings may represent a person, a symbolic figure, or something connected with the beliefs of the community. Without written records, the stone remains difficult to interpret. The location of the monument may also have mattered. It was built near the Tagus River, a major natural feature running through the region. The river would have shaped movement, resources, and the surrounding landscape. The monument may have served as a landmark, a burial place, or a sacred location connected with the landscape around it. The builders belonged to communities that were already farming. They cultivated crops, kept animals, and lived in increasingly settled settlements, yet their technology was still based largely on stone, wood, and other natural materials. Moving enormous stones required organization. People had to work together, prepare the ground, and coordinate the placement of each block. The monument therefore tells us something about prehistoric society. A structure like Guadalperol could not have been built casually. It required planning, labor, and cooperation. The people who built it may have returned to the monument for generations, adding burials, performing ceremonies, or maintaining traditions connected with their ancestors. For thousands of years, the monument remained part of the landscape. Then modern engineering changed everything. The construction of the Valdecañas reservoir flooded the area, and Guadalperol disappeared beneath the water. The ancient stones were submerged, leaving only fragments of the monument visible during particularly low water levels. For decades, the monument was largely inaccessible. Then severe drought caused the reservoir level to fall dramatically. The stones emerged once again, images of the site spread widely, and people suddenly saw a prehistoric monument that had been hidden beneath the reservoir for generations. The drought was a warning, but it also created a rare archaeological opportunity. Researchers began documenting the exposed remains. They could examine the stones, the layout, and the condition of the monument, but exposure also created new risks. The site had spent decades underwater, and the sudden change in conditions could damage the ancient materials. Protecting the monument became an important challenge. The story of Guadalperol is therefore unusual. It is both an archaeological discovery and a modern environmental story. A monument built more than 5,000 years ago was eventually submerged by a modern reservoir. Then climate conditions revealed it again. The same landscape had changed dramatically, but the stones remained. The monument also reminds us that prehistoric Europe was filled with megalithic structures. People across different regions built dolmens, stone circles, passage graves, and other monuments. Some were small, others were enormous. Their exact traditions differed, but many were connected with death, memory, and the relationship between communities and their ancestors. Guadalperol belongs to that much larger prehistoric tradition. Today, the monument is sometimes compared with Stonehenge. But Guadalperol is considerably older than the famous stone circle in England. Its builders belong to a much earlier period, long before the great monuments of later prehistoric Britain were completed.
The comparison is useful for understanding its age. But Guadalperol has its own story. The most mysterious part remains the decorated stone.
What did its markings mean? Who was represented? And why was the image carved into the monument?
There is no written explanation. The original beliefs disappeared with the people who created them. All that remains is the stone, and the marks left on its surface. The stone monument beneath the water shows how easily ancient history can disappear beneath the modern world. More than 5,000 years ago, a prehistoric community moved enormous stones, built a burial monument, and created a place meant to survive generations. Thousands of years later, a reservoir covered it. Then drought brought it back into view. For a brief moment, the ancient stones emerged from the water once again,
allowing the modern world to see a monument that had been hidden for decades, and a small piece of prehistoric Spain to return to the surface. The tomb filled with 24 dog skulls, on a quiet island in northern Scotland. Inside a prehistoric stone tomb, archaeologists found something unexpected. Not weapons, not treasure, but the skulls of dogs. Around 24 of them were discovered inside Cewin Hill Chambered Cairn, a Neolithic burial monument on the Orkney Islands. Why were so many dogs placed inside an ancient tomb? The answer is still uncertain. Cewin Hill stands on the island of Mainland, one of the main islands of Orkney. The cairn was built around 3000 BC during the Neolithic period. At that time, Orkney was home to farming communities that built impressive stone monuments across the islands. They constructed houses, stone circles, tombs, and ceremonial sites. Cewin Hill was one of their burial monuments. The tomb was built into a natural hill. A stone passage leads from the outside into a central chamber. Several smaller side chambers branch away from it. The design allowed people to enter the tomb, move through the narrow passage, and reach the burial chamber deep inside. The structure was carefully constructed from large stone slabs, then covered with a mound of earth and stone. Inside, archaeologists discovered human remains. The tomb had been used for multiple burials, possibly over several generations. But among those remains, they found something unusual. Dog skulls, not one or two, but around 24. Their presence immediately raised questions about the role of dogs in Neolithic Orkney. Dogs were already living alongside humans thousands of years ago. They could help with hunting, guard settlements, and manage livestock. But placing dog remains inside a burial monument is different. It suggests that at least some dogs may have had a special relationship with the community. Perhaps they were working animals, companions, or animals with symbolic importance. We cannot know exactly which. The skulls were not all from the same period. Some may have been placed inside the tomb at different times. This suggests that the dogs were connected with the monument over a longer period. Rather than being buried during one single event, the tomb itself appears to have been used repeatedly. Generations returned, added burials, and continued traditions connected with the dead. The dogs also varied in size. Some were similar to modern medium-sized dogs, while others were larger. Their remains can reveal information about the animals themselves, including their age, size, and physical condition. This helps researchers understand what kinds of dogs lived alongside Neolithic communities in Orkney. The relationship between humans and dogs may have been especially important in island communities. Farmers depended on animals, including cattle, sheep, and other livestock. Dogs could have helped control and protect these animals. They may also have assisted with hunting. A dog was therefore potentially useful in many parts of daily life. But the burial evidence suggests that their relationship with humans could go beyond practical work. The question is, why skulls? Why were the heads of the dogs preserved and placed inside the tomb? One possibility is ritual. The skull may have represented the animal as a whole, even after the rest of its body had disappeared. Another possibility is that particular dogs were treated differently because of their role in the community. Perhaps they belonged to important individuals, or were associated with particular activities. Again, there is no written evidence to confirm the explanation. The tomb itself was not a simple grave. Neolithic chambered cairns across Orkney often contained multiple human burials. They may have been places where communities returned repeatedly, bringing the remains of the dead into a shared ancestral space. Cewin Hill appears to fit into this wider tradition. The dead were placed together, and the monument remained part of the landscape. Orkney contains several extraordinary Neolithic monuments. Nearby sites such as Machaut, the Stones of Stenness, and the Ring of Brodgar show how important monumental construction was in the region. These communities had the ability to organize large building projects, move heavy stones,
and create carefully planned ceremonial landscapes. Queen Hill belonged to the same broader world. The people who built the cairn did not leave written records. There are no inscriptions explaining the dogs. There are no texts describing their beliefs. Archaeologists must therefore study the physical evidence.
Where were the skulls found? How old were the animals? How were the remains positioned? And what else was placed nearby? Each detail can provide another clue. One of the most fascinating possibilities is that dogs may have been seen as companions beyond death. We know that dogs had lived alongside humans for thousands of years, but the deliberate placement of their remains within a burial monument suggests that some animals may have held a special position. Perhaps the people of Queen Hill believed that certain dogs should remain close to the community, even after death. That idea is impossible to prove, but the archaeological evidence makes it worth considering. The tomb eventually stopped being used. The entrance was closed. The community changed, and the monument became part of the landscape. For thousands of years, the chamber remained hidden beneath the mound. The dogs were forgotten. Their bones remained inside, alongside the remains of the people they may once have lived with. When archaeologists investigated Queen Hill, they uncovered the chamber, human remains, and the unusual collection of dog skulls. The discovery added an unexpected detail to the history of Neolithic Orkney. These were not simply farming communities, building stone monuments. They were communities with complex relationships with animals, and possibly with ideas about death that included more than humans. Today, the chambered cairn remains one of Orkney's intriguing prehistoric monuments. The stones are weathered. The original mound has changed, and much of the ancient burial ritual is impossible to reconstruct. But the evidence remains. 24 dog skulls, placed inside a tomb more than 5,000 years ago. We may never know whether these dogs were beloved companions, valued working animals, or symbols connected with a forgotten ritual. Perhaps they were all three. What is certain is that someone decided they belonged inside the tomb, and that decision survived for thousands of years.